All right, in chapter 10, lesson 2, we're going to talk about unbiased and biased samples. And the good news is that there's not really a lot of math in this section. So if you really don't like when we have to end up, using mathematical concepts, then you might enjoy this lesson. But the bad news is it's just a little bit weird what we're talking about here. And really, the word biased, maybe if you've ever heard that before, when something is biased, there's a problem in the viewpoint that's expressed. So, for example, if someone asked me what is the best subject, and I, as a math teacher, answer math, someone would say, well, you're a little biased because you already teach that. So that's going to influence my opinion. Or if someone asked me, if you surveyed people and asked in the city of St. Louis who the greatest baseball player ever was, you may not get a really good representation because St. Louis is home to the Cardinals. And so a lot of people might be influenced to say the greatest baseball player is someone that played for the St. Louis Cardinals. So in how data is collected, you can sometimes get something that's not really valid because of how that information is collected. So that's really what we're dealing with here, of telling whether something is biased or unbiased, and then even telling why it's called that. So looking at a couple different terms. So we're going to need some vocabulary, and often I kind of breeze over the vocabulary, but here we're going to need these terms that come up. So you'll see those in the homework assignment in this chapter. All right. So an unbiased sample, I already kind of talked about biased a little bit. So if it's unbiased, it's is selected so that it accurately represents the entire population, especially when things are very random of who is picked to be surveyed. But anytime you control the group that you're surveying, so for example, there has to be some control to some degree, but if I only surveyed my math students on something, that's not a great way of doing that because I'm not opening up to the entire population of students of that grade or the entire population of students for the school. So it's got to accurately represent that. So a biased sample is kind of opposite of that, of unbiased. A simple random sample is each item or person is equally likely to be chosen. So that's going to be an unbiased sample. If it's simple and random, that's good. One of the ways that it can be random is by systematically making it random. So if every 10th person that leaves Walmart is surveyed, that is systematically random because they're not saying, oh, well, they're a male, I'm going to survey them. That would be a biased sample because you'd be neglecting the female population. So systematic is you're choosing by a certain time period or time interval or a certain number of people pass through before you survey them. So these are both examples of unbiased samples. Those are good things when that happens. Biased samples are either when they're done either through convenience or voluntary response. I've already talked about what a biased sample is. When the population is favored over others, it's going to give you an invalid conclusion. So some of the times this happens because when the survey is completed, it is done out of convenience. Maybe instead of trying to survey every single person, you're selecting a certain group. So like I said, selecting only my math students to survey, I'm doing that out of convenience. It's going to be a lot made more difficult to get the survey out to other classes. But if I just survey the students I see every day, that's out of convenience, and I'm probably going to get a biased sample. So I think what's hard in this lesson is I think a lot of the times the surveys that are collected are probably in some ways biased in how that's done. Also, especially if you have been, like out at a restaurant and they ask for, some kind of a review on your experience, those are considered voluntary responses. I know as a consumer myself, I used to do those a lot for Kroger, and I got additional fuel points if I left a survey. But it was a voluntary response. I wasn't required to do that. And that's going to also make a biased sample because you're requiring people that are probably either really really happy with their experience or really really not happy with it to make those. If you're really upset about something, you might fill out a survey to really make sure people understand your opinion. But it could be the other way as well. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk about this first example here. A radio station asks its listeners to indicate their preference for one of two candidates in an upcoming election. 72% of the listeners who responded preferred candidate A, so the radio station announced that candidate A would win the election. Is the conclusion valid? Justify your answer. So in this one, let me go ahead and move on to the next slide so you can kind of see the results here. This sample is a voluntary response because the radio station has sent out the survey, but people then have to respond, right? It asks its listeners, and so not every person responds. So maybe people that have a really strong opinion one or the other is the ones that are responding. And so this is going to be a biased sample. It is not, the conclusion cannot be considered valid. It would be invalid because you're requiring that voluntary response instead of just making it random. All right, example number 2. And I'll just stop here and say that some of these are problems from your homework, so I would especially pay attention as I go through these. A guidance counselor asked students who own cell phones which was the last type of download each one downloaded to their cell phone. The results are shown in the table. So we see here the most downloaded thing was music, and screensaver or ringtones were 25, and then screensavers were 14, and games were 10. So what type of sample is this is the question. This sample, it's biased because it's out of convenience. The guidance counselor only sent out the survey to students that have cell phones, who own cell phones. They didn't survey every student that would be downloading because maybe they're downloading on somebody else's phone. So this sample is biased because of convenience. Example number 3, a randomly selected dentist asks his patients why they may be hesitant to go to a dentist. What type of sample is this? So this one is also going to be out of convenience because he's only surveying his patients. Now it's randomly selected, which is good, but it's only one dentist. And so that's maybe part of the problem here. It's not like all dentists in an area are giving this survey. It's only one particular dentist. And maybe that dentist, has certain clientele that would, make them hesitant to go to the dentist. So even surveying people that are not going to the dentist might be a good indicator, because if you're only surveying the people that have arrived at the dentist, they may not be as hesitant, right? Like people that are really hesitant are not going to the dentist. And this is the final example. Every 10th person who walks into a department store is surveyed to determine his or her music preference. Out of the 150 customers, 70 stated that they prefer rock music. The manager concludes that about half of all customers prefer rock music because 70 is roughly about half of 150. So what type of sample is this? It is systematically random because every 10th person that walks into the department store, and whether, if they're male or female, what their taste in music is, they're getting surveyed. So systematically random based on numbers. So these results could be considered unbiased and they would be valid. So that's just kind of a little bit of an overview. We're going to end up using those terms that we talked about earlier. I'll go back to that slide so you can see that. So these terms of systematic random and simple random, and then also convenient and voluntary response. Make sure you kind of understand what those terms are meaning, because that will help you in completing the homework. So that should do it for lesson 2 of chapter 10. Thanks for watching.